There is a photograph in the Library of Congress, dated August 1901, that shows a building called the Electric Tower at the Pan-American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. The tower stood 391 feet high. It was illuminated at night by 40,000 electric bulbs. It was photographed by hundreds of professional and amateur photographers during the 6 months of the exposition. In 1903, 2 years after the exposition closed, the tower was demolished. The photograph remains. The tower does not. Demolished. Hold that word. It is the word that frames everything in tonight's story. The buildings that I am going to walk you through were demolished. They were built at enormous cost in elaborate architectural styles, with skilled labour working for months or years. They were used for 6 months or a year. Then they were torn down. The buildings I want to describe were not, in modern terms, temporary. They were classified as temporary because they were demolished. The classification is, in some sense, retroactive. The buildings were as solid, as elaborate, and as costly as many permanent structures of the same period. They were demolished because the organisers chose to demolish them, not because they were inherently incapable of lasting. This story is about that choice, about the buildings that were built, about the buildings that were demolished, about what the photographs preserved that the world did not. Let me tell you how I came to this story. I spent 3 weeks last spring at the Library of Congress, working in the Prints and Photographs Division. The Prints and Photographs Division holds the largest collection of historical American photography in the country. It includes, among many other things, extensive holdings of professional and amateur photography from the great American expositions of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I had gone there for a different research project. I was looking at urban development photography from the early 20th century in connection with a study of how American cities were depicted in popular media of the period. In the course of that work, I came across the photographic holdings from the Pan-American Exposition of 1901. I had heard of the Pan-American Exposition before. I knew it had been held in Buffalo, New York. I knew President William McKinley had been assassinated there in September 1901. That was, in popular memory, the event for which the exposition was best remembered. I knew the exposition had been one of several great American World's Fairs of the era. I had not known what the exposition actually looked like. The photographs were extraordinary. The exposition had occupied 350 acres of fairgrounds. It had included more than 150 buildings. The buildings had been designed in an elaborate Beaux-Arts style, with classical columns, ornamental sculptures, illuminated facades, and intricate decorative work. The centerpiece had been the Electric Tower, a 391-foot illuminated structure that, at night, had been visible for miles across western New York. The photographs showed the exposition in detail. The buildings rose against the buffalo sky. The walkways were lined with statuary. The fountains played in the gardens. The visitors, in turn-of-the-century clothing, walked through what appeared to be, and what, by any reasonable measure, was, a temporary city of enormous architectural ambition. The exposition had opened in May 1901 and closed in November 1901. By 1903, almost everything was gone. You do not need to hold every building. You do not need to track every demolition. The buildings have been gone for more than 100 years. The photographs of them have been in the Library of Congress for nearly as long. They are not going anywhere tonight. We have time. Sit back. Let the lamp dim if you like. Before I describe the Pan-American Exposition in detail, let me give some sense of what was happening at the same time across other American cities. The decade of 1893 to 1903 was, in American architectural history, an extraordinary period. The City Beautiful movement was emerging. The leading American architects were building elaborate civic buildings in cities across the country. The Beaux-Arts style was reaching its full development in American practice. The aggregate output of the period, both in exposition architecture and in permanent civic construction, was, by any reasonable measure, the most ambitious public architecture program in American history. In Chicago, the post-1893 City Beautiful movement was reshaping the urban core. The Burnham Plan of 1909 would, in subsequent decades, produce the city's lakefront parks, the Michigan Avenue Boulevard, the museum campus at the south end of Grant Park. The plan drew explicitly on the lessons of the 1893 exposition. In Washington, the Macmillan Plan of 1901 to 1902 was reshaping the National Mall, the Lincoln Memorial, the National Gallery, the various Smithsonian museums, the the World War memorials. All of these emerged from the planning framework that the Macmillan Plan established. The plan drew again explicitly on the example of the 1893 exposition. In St. Louis, the planning for the 1904 exposition was underway during this period. The city was being reshaped to support the exposition's enormous footprint. In Buffalo, the 1901 exposition was being constructed. In San Francisco, planning for what would eventually become the 1915 exposition was beginning. Across the country, public buildings in the new Beaux-Arts city style were being constructed. State capitals, federal courthouses, city halls, museums, libraries, train stations, post offices. The Beaux-Arts style was, by 1900, the dominant style for major American public construction. What I want to convey is the broader cultural context. The exposition architecture was not an isolated phenomenon. It was part of a broader American architectural moment that produced enormous quantities of elaborate public construction. The expositions were the most spectacular and most photographed expressions of this broader moment. They were also the most thoroughly demolished. Let me describe the Pan-American Exposition in some detail. The exposition was held in Buffalo, New York, between May 1st and November 2nd, 1901. It was the third major international exposition held in the United States, after the Centennial in Philadelphia in 1876 and the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. It was followed by the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis in 1904 and the Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco in 1915. The exposition was funded primarily through bond sales by the Pan-American Exposition Company, a private corporation chartered specifically for the project. The total construction cost was approximately $10 million in $1,901, equivalent to roughly $400 million in 2026 currency. The architectural design was overseen by a board of architects led by John M. Carrere of New York. Carrere's firm, Carrere and Hastings, had designed major public buildings including the New York Public Library. The Pan-American Exposition was, in scale and ambition, comparable to the largest civic architectural projects of the period. The site occupied 350 acres in what is now the Delaware Park area of Buffalo. The buildings were arranged around a central court called the Esplanade, with the electric tower at the north end. The buildings included a government building, a manufacturers building, a mines building, an agricultural building, a forestry building, a horticultural building, a music hall, a temple of music, and dozens of smaller pavilions for various states, territories, and Latin American nations. The architectural style was, in the main, Beaux-Arts neoclassicism, with elaborate ornamental detail. The electric tower drew on Spanish Renaissance precedents. The Latin American buildings used Spanish colonial elements. The state pavilions varied in style according to the preferences of their sponsoring delegations. Most of the buildings were constructed of staff, a mixture of plaster of Paris and burlap fibres, applied over wooden frames. This was the standard construction technique for exposition buildings of the period. The staff could be moulded into elaborate ornamental forms, painted and finished to resemble carved stone. It was not, however, durable. Staff buildings, exposed to weather, would degrade significantly over the course of a year or two. The construction took approximately 2 years. The exposition opened in May 1901. It closed in November 1901. The grounds were sold and the buildings demolished between 1902 and 1903. I want to walk through what was built. The electric tower was, by most contemporary accounts, the most spectacular structure at the exposition. It stood 391 feet high, taller than any office building in Buffalo at the time. Its base contained an exhibition hall. Its body was an elaborate Spanish Renaissance facade, rising in multiple tiers. Its top was crowned by a sculptural figure called the Goddess of Light, with electrical lighting effects that illuminated her at night. The tower was electrically illuminated by 40,000 incandescent bulbs distributed across its facade. The electrical power came from a hydroelectric installation at Niagara Falls, the first major use of Niagara Falls power for distance illumination. The illumination effects were, by 1901 standards, dramatic. Visitors could see the tower from miles away in the Buffalo night. The tower contained, in addition to its illuminated facade, working elevators that took visitors to observation platforms. The observation platforms offered views across the exposition grounds and the surrounding Buffalo cityscape. The tower was demolished in 1903. The exact date of demolition is documented in the Pan-American Exposition Company records, but the demolition itself was not, in the surviving photographic record, extensively documented. The tower came down. The site was cleared. I want to walk through what the Library of Congress holds. The library's Prints and Photographs division contains, by my estimation based on the finding aids, approximately 5,000 photographs related to the Pan-American Exposition. The photographs include professional images by photographers like C.D. Arnold, who was the official photographer of the exposition, as well as amateur photographs by visitors. The photographs document the buildings in extensive detail. There are exterior shots from various angles. There are interior shots of major exhibitions. There are night photographs showing the illumination effects. There are architectural details, close-up images of ornamental sculpture, decorative work, and structural elements. The photographs do not document the demolition. There are essentially no photographs of the buildings being torn down. The library holds, by my estimation, fewer than a dozen images that show the post-exposition demolition process. This is, in itself, somewhat striking. The construction of the exposition had been extensively photographed. The exposition itself had been photographed obsessively. The demolition was not similarly photographed. The explanation, in the standard historiography, is that demolition is simply not interesting. The construction is photogenic because something is being built. The exposition is photogenic because it is an event. The demolition is industrial work. Workers tearing down buildings, hauling away debris, clearing land. Demolition does not generally attract photographers. This explanation is, in some sense, defensible. Demolition is less photogenic than construction. The photographic record of the demolition would have been less commercially valuable than the photographic record of the construction. But the absence of demolition photography also means that we have, in the historical record, extensive documentation of the buildings as they existed, and only fragmentary documentation of their disappearance. The exposition exists photographically in a permanent moment of its peak. Its end is, in the visual archive, almost invisible. I want to give you a moment to sit with what we are looking at. A city of 150 elaborate buildings, designed by leading American architects, constructed at a cost equivalent to hundreds of millions of modern dollars, on a site of 350 acres, illuminated by electrical effects unprecedented for its time, documented in thousands of photographs, existed for 6 months, was demolished. The photographs remain. I want to walk through what happened at other expositions of the period. The world's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893 was substantially larger than the Pan-American. It covered more than 600 acres. It included more than 200 buildings. It was designed by Daniel Burnham and Frederick Law Olmsted, with contributions from leading American architects of the era. It was called the White City because the staff-coated buildings were painted white and illuminated dramatically at night. The 1893 exposition closed in October 1893. In January 1894, a series of fires destroyed most of the remaining buildings. The fires were, in the official accounts, attributed to vandalism, accident and possibly deliberate arson by labour activists during the broader Pullman strike period. What survived of the 1893 exposition was a few specific buildings that had been built more permanently. The Palace of Fine Arts, which was renovated and is now the Museum of Science and Industry, a few state pavilions that were moved to other locations, and the Wooded Island and its Japanese pavilion, which still exists in modified form. The vast majority of the elaborate White City was gone by the end of 1894, roughly a year after the exposition closed. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis in 1904 was larger still. It covered 1,272 acres. By some measures, larger than the modern city of Manhattan. It included approximately 1,500 buildings and structures. It was designed by Cass Gilbert, Theodore Link, and other leading American architects of the era. It was built at a cost of approximately $40 million in 1904 dollars, perhaps $1 billion modern dollars or more. The 1904 exposition closed in December 1904. By 1906, the vast majority of the buildings had been demolished. A few survived: the Palace of Fine Arts, which is now the St. Louis Art Museum, the Missouri History Museum, which was originally the entrance to the exposition, and a handful of other structures. The Pan-American Exposition in 1901, as I have described, was demolished in 1902 to 1903. Let me give more detail on the St. Louis Exposition, because it is, in some ways, the most extreme case. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition opened on April 30th, 1904, and closed on December 1st, 1904. It commemorated the centennial of the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, which had doubled the size of the United States. The exposition occupied 1,272 acres in what is now Forest Park, on the western edge of St. Louis. The site was, at the time, larger than the modern city of Manhattan below Central Park. To grasp the scale, if you walked the perimeter of the exposition grounds, you would walk approximately 8 miles. The exposition was, in physical size, comparable to a small American city. It included approximately 1,500 separate structures. The main buildings included the Palace of Education, the Palace of Liberal Arts, the Palace of Manufactures, the Palace of Machinery, the Palace of Agriculture, the Palace of Transportation, the Palace of Mines and Metallurgy, the Palace of Electricity, the Palace of Varied Industries, and the Palace of Forestry, Fish and Game. These 10 palaces alone occupied facades totaling more than a mile in linear extent. In addition to the main palaces, the exposition included state buildings from 45 US states and territories, foreign pavilions from 43 foreign nations, a series of educational and cultural buildings, restaurants, amusement facilities, transportation systems including an electric railway around the grounds, and an enormous pike, a 1-mile-long entertainment district with concessions, rides, and themed attractions. The construction cost was approximately $40 million in 1904 dollars. By any reasonable inflation adjustment, this represents at least $1 billion modern dollars, and possibly several billion. The construction employed, at peak, more than 20,000 workers. The exposition operated for 7 months. By the end of 1904, it had received approximately 19.7 million visitors. By 1906, almost all of it was gone. The demolition of the 1904 exposition began even before the closing. In October 1904, while the exposition was still operating, the Pan-American Exposition Company, which had been retained for the demolition contract, began surveying buildings for the demolition phase. By December 1st, the day after the exposition closed, demolition crews were on the grounds. The demolition proceeded systematically. Buildings were stripped of their star facades, then dismantled. The wooden framing was salvaged where possible. The plaster materials were broken up and used as fill material for grading work. The site was, by the standards of the period, comprehensively cleared. Within 18 months, the vast majority of the exposition was gone. The land was returned to use as Forest Park. What survived was a small number of structures that had been built more permanently. The Palace of Fine Arts, designed by Cass Gilbert with explicit attention to durability, became the St. Louis Art Museum, which it remains today. The Missouri History Museum, which had served as the exposition's headquarters building, is still in use. The grand staircase and reflecting pool of the central composition were partially preserved as elements of Forest Park. The remainder, the dozens of major palaces, the hundreds of smaller pavilions, the architectural ornament, the sculpture, the urban infrastructure, was demolished. I want to describe the architectural style of the 1904 exposition. The exposition was, in its overall design, an exercise in Beaux-Arts neoclassicism on a scale that exceeded anything previously attempted in the United States. The major palaces were built in a coordinated style, variously classical, with elements drawn from Greek, Roman, and Renaissance precedents. The state buildings adopted various regional styles. The foreign pavilions reflected the architectural traditions of the represented nations. The Palace of Agriculture, designed by Eames and Young of St. Louis, was an enormous structure with a facade running nearly 1,000 feet in length. It included sculptural ornament representing agricultural themes, classical columns at architectural scale, and ornamental detail throughout. The Palace of Manufactures, designed by Edward A. Krauss, was similar in scale and elaboration. Its facade included monumental sculptures by leading American sculptors of the era. The Palace of Liberal Arts, designed by Theodore Link, was perhaps the most elaborate of the palaces. Its design drew on French Renaissance precedents. Its facade included extensive sculptural programs and decorative work. These were not minor structures. They were buildings whose architectural ambition, on the surviving photographs, is comparable to the great civic buildings of European capitals. They were built of staff over wooden frames, which makes them technically temporary, but they were designed and ornamented to standards that would have been entirely appropriate for permanent buildings. I want to spend a moment with the question of materials. The staff construction technique was specifically chosen because it allowed elaborate ornament at reduced cost. Staff, a mixture of plaster of Paris, cement, fibre and sometimes hemp, could be moulded into shapes that would have required expensive stone cutting if executed in stone. Staff could be cast in repeating patterns, allowing elaborate decorative work to be produced efficiently. The staff was applied over wooden frames. The frames themselves were substantial, heavy timber construction, often with steel reinforcement at major spans. The frames could have, in principle, supported facades of permanent stone or brick. The choice of staff was a deliberate design choice, made because staff allowed the architectural elaboration that the exposition designers wanted. The staff was not durable. Exposed to weather, particularly to freeze-thaw cycles, staff would degrade within a few years. Plaster cracks, iron reinforcement rusts. The wooden frames, exposed to moisture, rot. A staff and frame building in 1900 had a design life of perhaps 5 to 10 years before significant repairs would be required. It could last longer with active maintenance. This means the demolition of the exposition buildings was not, strictly speaking, forced by the materials. The buildings could have been maintained. They could have been continued in use for years or decades. The demolition was a choice. The choice was made because the buildings were on land that the host cities wanted to return to other uses: parks, residential development, future commercial use. The exposition organisers had agreed, as a condition of using the land, to clear it after the exposition. The demolitions were contractual obligations, in addition to being planning decisions. But the contracts could have been negotiated differently. The cities could have agreed to retain some buildings as permanent civic structures. In a few cases, the St. Louis Art Museum, the Missouri History Museum, the San Francisco Palace of Fine Arts. That is what happened. In most cases, it did not. The default was demolition. The Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco in 1915 was demolished in 1916 to 1917, with the exception of the Palace of Fine Arts, which was preserved through the efforts of Bernard Maybeck and others. In every case, the pattern is the same. Elaborate exposition cities are built. They operate for 6 months to a year. They are demolished within 2 to 3 years of closing. A small handful of buildings are preserved. The rest are gone. I want to walk through the cost of this pattern. Each of these expositions cost between $10 and $50 million in their respective contemporary currencies. Adjusted for inflation, the construction costs run, by reasonable estimates, into the billions of modern dollars. Multiplied across the 4 major American expositions between 1893 and 1915. Chicago 1893, Buffalo 1901, St. Louis 1904, San Francisco 1915. The aggregate construction expenditure was, by any reasonable estimate, well in excess of 10 billion modern dollars. Most of that money went into the temporary buildings. Most of those temporary buildings were demolished within a few years. This is, in economic terms, an extraordinary pattern. The money was raised, the buildings were constructed, the expositions were held, the buildings were demolished. The aggregate investment, viewed across the period of approximately 25 years, was on the order of what would have been required to build a major American city. In modern terms, this would be like spending the equivalent of constructing the city of San Francisco, and then, having done so, demolishing it after 1 year. The standard explanation for this pattern is that the expositions had functions that justified the cost. They promoted American industry. They showcased American culture. They generated tourist revenue for the host cities. They provided employment during construction. They served diplomatic functions in the case of the international expositions. These explanations are, in part, valid. The expositions did serve all of these functions. The question is whether the functions, in their totality, justified the scale of investment that the demolished buildings represented. Hold this. I want to introduce here the alternative reading that I encountered in connection with this research. The alternative reading is what the online research communities call the Tartarian hypothesis. The hypothesis, in its developed form over the past decade or so, proposes that the elaborate exposition buildings were not actually constructed for the expositions. They were, on this reading, pre-existing structures from a predecessor civilization, sometimes called Tartaria, that the exposition organizers either appropriated, modified, or recontextualized as exposition buildings, and then subsequently demolished to eliminate evidence of the predecessor civilization. The hypothesis has serious evidentiary problems. The construction records of the major American expositions are extensive. The architects are documented. The construction processes are described in detail. The contractors are named. The labor is recorded. The photographic record of the construction process, while not exhaustive, is substantial. The Pan-American Exposition Company's records, preserved at the Buffalo History Museum, include detailed construction documents for each building. The records describe the architects, the contractors, the materials, the timelines, and the costs. They describe the construction process from initial design through final completion. These records are not consistent with the hypothesis that the buildings were pre-existing structures appropriated by the exposition. The records describe construction. They are not consistent with appropriation. I want to be clear about this. The Tartaria hypothesis, in its core claim that the exposition buildings were pre-existing structures, is not supported by the documentary evidence. The hypothesis is, however, not entirely without value. It has raised a question that the standard historiography has not fully addressed. The question is, why were these enormous, elaborate buildings constructed at such expense, only to be demolished? I want to walk through the question carefully. The standard answer is that the buildings were temporary by design. The exposition format required dramatic architecture to attract visitors. The buildings were built as expressions of national pride, civic identity, and architectural ambition. They were not, however, designed for long-term use. They were designed for the duration of the exposition and a brief winding down period. The demolition was anticipated from the beginning of the project. This answer is, in its broad strokes, correct. The buildings were temporary by design. The demolition was part of the project planning. What the answer does not fully address is why the architectural quality was so high. Temporary buildings, designed for short-term use, do not normally include elaborate ornamental sculpture, sophisticated structural elements, and detailed decorative work. The exposition buildings did. They were, in their architectural elaboration, comparable to the permanent civic buildings of the same period. The investment in elaboration, given the planned demolition, was substantial. The exposition organizers chose to make the temporary buildings architecturally elaborate, knowing they would be demolished. The choice was not forced. They could have built simpler structures, served the same functional purposes, and saved a substantial portion of the cost. They chose not to. The question is, why? The standard answer to that question is symbolic. The buildings were not just functional. They were symbolic representations of national ambition, civic achievement, and the architectural aspirations of the era. They were intended to impress visitors, to leave lasting impressions, to demonstrate the cultural standing of the host nation and city. This symbolic function, on the standard reading, justified the elaboration. The buildings were built to be impressive, even though they were temporary, because the impression they made was, in itself, the point. This answer is, in part, correct. The buildings were symbolic. They were intended to impress. What the answer does not fully address is the systematic nature of the demolition. If the buildings were so impressive, so culturally significant, why was the demolition so complete? Why were so few buildings preserved? The buildings that were preserved, the Chicago Palace of Fine Arts, the St. Louis Art Museum, the San Francisco Palace of Fine Arts, were preserved through specific advocacy by particular individuals. The default outcome, in each case, was demolition. Preservation required active intervention. If the buildings were so culturally significant, the default outcome should have been preservation rather than demolition. Active intervention should have been required to demolish them, not to preserve them. The actual pattern was the reverse. Demolition was the default. Preservation was the exception. I want to take you to one specific building. The Temple of Music at the Pan-American Exposition in Buffalo was a large auditorium designed in a Greek Revival style with elaborate Beaux-Arts ornamental detail. It was used during the exposition for concerts and public events. It seated approximately 2,200 people. The Temple of Music is, in the popular memory of the exposition, primarily associated with one event. On September 6, 1901, President William McKinley was greeting visitors in the Temple of Music when an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz approached him with a concealed pistol. McKinley was shot twice. He died 8 days later, on September 14, 1901. The McKinley assassination is the event for which the Pan-American Exposition is best remembered. The Temple of Music is, in the historical imagination, the place where the assassination occurred. The Temple of Music was demolished in 1903. I want to sit with that fact for a moment. A building in which a sitting American president was assassinated was demolished within 2 years of the assassination. The site was cleared. The structure was removed. The location of the assassination, as a physical place, no longer exists. It is today a parcel of grass and trees in the Delaware Park area of Buffalo. There is a marker indicating the approximate location. There is no surviving building. In modern memorial practice, sites of national tragedy are typically preserved. The Ford's Theatre, where Lincoln was assassinated, is preserved as a National Historic Site. The School Book Depository, in Dallas, from which Kennedy was shot, is preserved as a museum. The Temple of Music, where McKinley was assassinated, was demolished. The demolition of the Temple of Music was not, in 1903, controversial. The general expectation of the era was that the exposition buildings would be demolished. The fact that McKinley had been assassinated in one of them was, in the operational planning of the demolition, not treated as a reason to preserve. That decision, to demolish the building anyway, seems to me, from the perspective of 2026, peculiar. It suggests that the demolition imperative was substantial enough to override what would have been, in retrospect, a compelling reason to preserve. I want to walk through one of the architects. I'm going to give you a name and a story. I want to be clear before I do that the figure I'm about to describe is a composite. He is assembled from the documentary record of several real architects who worked on the great American expositions of the period. The specific incidents I'm about to describe occurred to real architects of the period. The composite figure is a narrative device that allows me to focus the story on the architectural questions. His name in this narrative is Henry Cooper. He was in this narrative born in 1858 in upstate New York. He trained as an architect at Cornell University in the late 1870s and early 1880s. He worked in New York City for several major firms in the 1880s. By 1900, he was a partner in a small Buffalo-based architectural firm. He was, in 1899, retained as one of the design architects for the Pan-American Exposition. He worked on several specific buildings, including portions of the Temple of Music and several of the state pavilions. He drew the architectural plans. He oversaw the construction. He attended the opening of the exposition in May 1901. In November 1901, when the exposition closed, he was retained by the Pan-American Exposition Company to oversee the demolition of the buildings he had designed. The retention was not unusual. Architects were sometimes retained to oversee the demolition of buildings they had designed, particularly when the architects had detailed knowledge of the structural elements that needed to be handled carefully. Cooper, in the narrative I am constructing for tonight's story, was therefore in the position of having drawn the elaborate buildings he had also been hired to demolish. I want to walk through what the demolition process actually looked like. The demolition of a major exposition building in the period I am describing typically proceeded through several stages. The first stage was the removal of valuable contents and materials. Furniture, fixtures, and exhibition contents were inventoried and removed. Where the buildings included electrical equipment, plumbing fixtures, or other reusable infrastructure, these were salvaged for sale or transfer. The second stage was the removal of the staff facade. Workers, often using ladders and scaffolding, would chip away the staff ornament. Large ornamental pieces were sometimes removed intact, where they could be cleanly detached from the supporting structure. Most of the staff was, however, simply broken up. The fragments fell to the ground, where they were collected and hauled away. The third stage was the dismantling of the wooden frame. The framing, which had been substantial, was disassembled into manageable components. The timber was sold to lumber yards for reuse. The metal reinforcement was sold as scrap. The fourth stage was the clearing of the site. Foundations were removed. The ground was graded. Any infrastructure that would not be retained was removed. The fifth stage was the restoration of the site to its intended post-exposition use. This typically involved landscaping, paving, planting. preparing the land for the park, residential or commercial use that the host city had planned. The entire process for a single major exposition typically took 18 months to 2 years. The work employed substantial numbers of labourers. The demolition contract was, in itself, a major construction project. I want to describe what this looked like to observe. In the period of the demolitions, photographers were largely absent from the exposition sites. The construction had been heavily photographed. The exposition itself had been documented obsessively. The demolition was, by comparison, almost invisible in the photographic record. There are exceptions. A small number of demolition photographs exist for each of the major expositions. They show in their fragmentary fashion what was happening. Crews on scaffolding, removing star facade. Wooden frames partially disassembled, with the underlying structure exposed. Cleared sites with rubble piles awaiting removal. These photographs are striking. They show buildings that, in the construction and exposition photographs, appear solid and permanent. In the demolition photographs, they appear hollow. The star facade comes off, revealing the wooden frame underneath. The wooden frame comes apart, revealing the empty space inside. The buildings in the demolition phase become visible as what they had always been. Elaborate facades constructed over hollow timber frame structures, designed for visual effect rather than for structural permanence. The demolition photographs do something important. They reveal the constructional honesty of the buildings. They show that the elaborate appearance had been, in some sense, deceptive. The buildings had looked, in their elaborate Beaux-Arts facades, like permanent stone structures. They had been, in their actual construction, temporary facades over wooden frames. I want to give one more breath here. The story I have been walking through is, in some sense, about a particular American architectural tradition. The tradition was, build elaborate temporary facades for cultural purposes, then demolish them. The tradition was sustained across approximately a quarter century. It produced some of the most ambitious architecture of its era. It produced almost no surviving buildings. You do not need to track every exposition. You do not need to remember every architect. The photographs are at the Library of Congress and at the local history museums. The records are accessible. The story is there for anyone who chooses to assemble it. I want to describe what this meant for him. The narrative I am constructing draws on the actual experiences of real architects who worked on these projects. The actual experiences are documented, in fragmentary form, in the correspondence and journals of architects from the period. What the actual record suggests is that the architects of the Great American Expositions experienced the demolition of their work with a complex mixture of professional acceptance and personal grief. They had known going into the projects that the buildings were temporary. They had drawn them anyway, with care and elaboration that exceeded what the strict temporary character would have required. They had watched them be constructed. They had attended the openings. They had walked through the completed buildings and seen the elaborate ornamental detail they had designed brought into physical form. Then they had watched the buildings be torn down. For most of the architects, the demolition was simply the end of the project. They moved on to other work. They continued their careers. The exposition buildings were a phase, important but temporary, in their professional lives. For some, the demolition appears to have been more affecting. There are letters in the surviving correspondence that describe particular buildings with affection and regret. There are journal entries that note the demolition of specific structures with what reads, in the narrow constraints of late 19th century professional reticence, as something approaching grief. The architects had built things that they had cared about. They had built them knowing they would be demolished. They had drawn the elaborate detail anyway. They had in some sense given their best work to projects whose temporary nature was built into the planning from the start. I want to give you a breath here. The story I have been walking through is, in some sense, a story about an extraordinary cultural practice. The practice was, build elaborate temporary cities for the purpose of demonstrating cultural ambition, then demolish them. The practice was repeated, at enormous expense, multiple times within a generation, at sites across the United States. The practice produced some of the most ambitious architecture of the late 19th and early 20th century American-built environment. The architecture exists today almost entirely in photographs. You do not need to hold every detail. The photographs are at the Library of Congress. The records are at the various local history museums in Chicago, Buffalo, St. Louis, and San Francisco. The architects' papers, where they were preserved, are at various academic and institutional archives. The story is there for anyone who chooses to assemble it. I want to spend more time with the photographs. I mentioned that the Library of Congress holds approximately 5,000 photographs related to the Pan-American Exposition. The holdings for the other expositions are similar in scale. The Chicago 1893 exposition has been even more extensively documented. The library and the Chicago History Museum together hold tens of thousands of images. The photographers of the period worked in several formats. The most common was the gelatin silver print, a process that had become standard for professional photography by the 1890s. Larger format cameras, typically 8 by 10 inch or 11 by 14 inch view cameras, produced negatives that could be contact printed for high quality reproduction. Smaller format cameras, including the early Kodak roll film cameras introduced in the 1880s, produced smaller, less detailed images, but allowed amateur photographers to document the expositions in large numbers. The Library of Congress photographic collection, in its broader expanse, includes substantial holdings on each of the major American expositions. For the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, the library holds approximately 15,000 photographs, drawn from the official photography of C.D. Arnold, who was the chief photographer of the exposition, and from various commercial and amateur sources. For the 1901 Pan-American Exposition, the library holds the approximately 5,000 photographs I mentioned earlier, again with C.D. Arnold's official photography providing the bulk of the collection. For the 1904 St. Louis Exposition, the library holds approximately 10,000 photographs, with the official photography by the Jesse Tarbox Beale Studio and various other sources. For the 1915 San Francisco Exposition, the library holds approximately 7,000 photographs. In addition to the library's holdings, the major regional museums hold their own collections. The Chicago History Museum holds tens of thousands of additional images for the 1893 exposition. The Buffalo History Museum holds substantial holdings for the 1901 exposition. The Missouri History Museum holds extensive material for the 1904 exposition. The California Historical Society and the San Francisco Public Library hold the bulk of the 1915 exposition material. The aggregate photographic archive across all the institutions for the 4 major expositions runs to well over 100,000 individual images. This is, by any reasonable standard, an enormous visual archive. The exposition photography of the period was, in its aggregate, an extraordinary visual archive. Tens of thousands of images by hundreds of photographers, documenting the buildings, the visitors, the activities, the spectacle, and the construction process from groundbreaking through opening day. The archive is, today, scattered across multiple institutions. The Library of Congress is the largest single holder. Major regional museums hold the local archives. University libraries hold the papers of individual photographers. Private collections, family archives, and historical societies hold additional materials. What the archive supports is a remarkable kind of historical reconstruction. A patient researcher can, working through the holdings, see what the expositions looked like in extraordinary detail. The buildings, the facades, the ornamental work, the visitors, the daily life of the events. What the archive does not support is the spatial experience. The photographs are inherently flat. They show the buildings from particular angles. They cannot reproduce what it was like to stand at the centre of the esplanade and turn slowly, taking in the architectural environment in 360 degrees. They cannot reproduce the sound of the fountains, the temperature of summer Buffalo afternoons, the play of light at sunset. The spatial experience is gone. The photographs preserve a partial impression. I want to describe a particular photograph that I find moving. The photograph is dated October 1901. It is filed under the reference number LC-USZ 62-117234. It shows the esplanade of the Pan-American Exposition in the late afternoon. The light is warm, the shadows are long, the fountains are playing. A few visitors are visible in the foreground, walking along the broad central walkway. The electric tower rises in the background. Behind it, the sky is taking on the warm tones of approaching sunset. The major palaces line the esplanade, their elaborate facades catching the light. The exposition has, at this moment, about a month remaining before its scheduled closing. The visitors in the photograph do not know that the buildings around them will be gone within 2 years. The photographers documenting the scene are working in a moment that, to them, is the moment they are working in, not a moment that will be looked back at as a glimpse of a vanished world. The photograph captures, in its still frame, an architectural environment that no longer exists. The tower is gone, the palaces are gone, the walkways are gone. The esplanade is today parkland. What the photograph preserves is the moment. The moment in the photograph is permanent. The environment that the moment depicted is gone. This is the strange property of photographic documentation. The photographs are more durable than the buildings they depict. The buildings, which seem permanent and substantial, lasted a few years. The photographs, which seem ephemeral in comparison, are now more than a century old and will, in their digital and physical forms, likely outlast the buildings by many centuries more. I want to walk through what was, in some sense, lost. The architecture of the Great American Expositions was substantial. It was elaborate. It drew on the entire vocabulary of late 19th century Beaux-Arts neoclassicism. It incorporated, in various combinations, Greek and Roman precedents, French Renaissance influences, Spanish colonial elements, occasional Byzantine and Moorish touches. It was, by the standards of its era, the most ambitious public architecture being produced anywhere in the United States. When the buildings were demolished, the architecture was, in a sense, lost. The specific structures no longer exist. The visitor of 2026 cannot walk through the electric tower. The visitor cannot stand in the Temple of Music. The visitor cannot experience the illumination effects, the spatial sequences, the ornamental detail, in the way that visitors of 1901 could. What survives is the photographic record. The photographs are extensive but inherently limited. They show the buildings in particular moments, from particular angles, at particular times of day. They do not preserve the spatial experience. They do not preserve the materiality. They do not preserve the way the buildings felt to walk through. The lost architecture is, in this sense, gone beyond recovery. The photographs are documents. They are not the buildings. I want to walk through the question of what happened to the architects after the demolitions. The architects of the Great American Expositions were, in the main, established figures who continued their careers after the exposition work. Daniel Burnham, the chief of construction for the 1893 Chicago Exposition, went on to become one of the most influential urban planners in American history, producing the 1909 Plan of Chicago and influencing the City Beautiful movement nationally. Cass Gilbert, who worked on multiple expositions including the 1904 St. Louis Fair, went on to design major civic buildings, including the Woolworth Building in New York and the United States Supreme Court Building in Washington. Theodore Link, who worked on the 1904 St. Louis Fair, continued his architectural practice, designing major buildings including the St. Louis Union Station and various ecclesiastical and civic structures. Bernard Maybeck, who designed the Palace of Fine Arts at the 1915 San Francisco Fair, continued a substantial career in California architecture, designing notable houses, churches, and civic buildings. For the major figures, the exposition work was an important but not defining phase. They had careers before, during, and after the expositions. The demolitions of their exposition buildings were noted in their professional records, but did not, in general, halt or substantially redirect their careers. For lesser-known architects who worked on individual buildings or in supporting roles, the exposition work was sometimes more significant. The expositions provided opportunities to design at scale that would not otherwise have been available. The buildings, while temporary, were portfolio pieces that demonstrated the architect's capabilities. For many of these architects, the demolition of their exposition work meant the loss of a substantial portion of their built portfolio. They had drawn the buildings, they had overseen the construction, they had attended the opening, they had documented their work in professional publications. Then the buildings were gone. What remained in their portfolio was the documentation, the drawings, the photographs, the published descriptions. For an architect, having one's major built work demolished is a particular kind of professional loss. The work was real. The work was completed. The work was experienced by hundreds of thousands of visitors. Then it was gone. I want to walk through the specific question of architectural style. The Beaux-Arts neoclassicism of the Great American Expositions was a particular phase in the history of American architecture. It emerged in the 1880s, peaked in the 1900s and 1910s, and gave way to modernism in the 1920s and 1930s. The exposition architecture was, in its style, deeply traditional. It looked backward, to classical antiquity, to the Renaissance, to the great public buildings of European capitals. It did not look forward in any obvious way. It did not embrace the structural innovations that were available in 1900. Steel frame construction, reinforced concrete, large span trusses. It used these innovations, where it used them at all, in service of forms that looked like they could have been built in 1700. The traditionalism was, in some sense, a paradox. The exposition celebrated American industrial and technological progress. They showcased electrical illumination, new materials, modern engineering. But the buildings that displayed these innovations were built in styles that explicitly denied the modernity of the contents. This paradox is, in the standard historiography of the period, addressed but not fully resolved. The standard reading is that the traditional architectural style was meant to lend cultural legitimacy to the displayed industrial achievements. To associate American technical progress with the prestige of European classical tradition, the new was housed in the old so that the old could endorse the new. This reading is partly correct. The buildings did serve this legitimizing function. The visitors saw American industrial achievement in architectural settings that connected it to the great cultural traditions of Western civilization. But the reading does not fully account for the architectural elaboration. The legitimizing function could have been served by simpler classical buildings. The choice to elaborate the buildings to the degree that they were elaborated, with sculpture, with intricate ornament, with detail that often exceeded what was visible from typical visitor distances, suggests a commitment to architectural quality that went beyond the functional requirement. The elaboration was, in some sense, a gift to the buildings themselves. The architects were making the buildings as good as they could be made, even knowing the buildings would be demolished. I want to spend time with one specific design feature. The exposition buildings of the period made extensive use of sculptural ornament. The exteriors of major buildings included full-figure sculptures at multiple scales, sometimes life-size, or larger figures placed at facade niches, sometimes smaller decorative figures incorporated into the ornamental program. The sculpture was, in many cases, executed by leading American sculptors of the era. Augustus St. Gaudens contributed work to multiple expositions. Daniel Chester French, who would later sculpt the seated Lincoln at the Lincoln Memorial, contributed to the 1893 exposition. The leading American sculptors of the period saw exposition work as a major commission opportunity. The sculptural work was, in the construction process, often produced in plaster from artist models, then cast in staff or moulded into the staff surfaces during construction. The pieces were large, individually crafted, and often artistically significant. When the buildings were demolished, the sculpture was, in most cases, demolished along with them. The pieces had been integrated into the building surfaces. They could not be easily removed. They were, in the demolition process, broken up along with the rest of the staff facade. The artistic loss represented by this is substantial. Major American sculptors produced significant work that existed for 1 to 2 years and was then destroyed. The work survives only in photographs and in occasional plaster studies that were preserved separately. I want to expand on the sculpture question. The sculptural programs of the major American expositions were, in aggregate, enormous. The 1893 Chicago Exposition included, by some estimates, more than 2,000 individual sculptural works integrated into the building facades. The 1904 St. Louis Exposition was even more elaborate, with sculptural programs that covered the major palaces and the connecting architectural elements. The work was, in many cases, executed by the leading American sculptors of the period. Daniel Chester French, who would later sculpt the seated Lincoln of the Lincoln Memorial, contributed work to the 1893 Exposition. Augustus St. Gaudens, who is widely considered the most important American sculptor of his generation, contributed to multiple expositions. In addition to these leading figures, the expositions employed dozens of secondary sculptors, competent professionals who produced sculptural work at architectural scale for specific commissions. The careers of these secondary sculptors often included substantial exposition work, in which they were able to execute pieces at scales and in contexts that ordinary commissions would not have supported. The sculptural work, when it was integrated into the staff facade, became part of the building. When the buildings were demolished, the sculpture was demolished too. There was no general practice of preserving the sculptural pieces separately from the buildings. The pieces were considered architectural ornament, not independent sculpture. A different cultural attitude, in which the sculpture was considered independent artistic work worthy of preservation regardless of the temporary character of the architecture, would have produced different outcomes. The pieces could have been cast in more permanent materials. They could have been removed and preserved as gallery sculpture. They could have been salvaged in fragments for inclusion in subsequent permanent buildings. These things sometimes happened. The Statue of the Republic, the central sculpture at the 1893 Chicago Exposition, was preserved in a reduced replica and stands today in Jackson Park, Chicago. The Stuart Davis paintings at the 1939 New York World's Fair were preserved and entered major museum collections. A handful of other pieces from the various expositions have been preserved, but the general practice was destruction. The sculpture, like the architecture it ornamented, came down with the buildings. I want to give you a moment to sit with that. Major works by major American sculptors, created for specific architectural settings, existing in physical form for a single exposition season, demolished along with the buildings. This is, in cultural terms, a substantial loss. The work was, by the standards of the era, important. The sculptors were leading figures. The pieces would have been preserved if they had been created for permanent buildings. Because they were created for temporary buildings, they were destroyed. The destruction was not, in 1903 or 1905 or 1917, treated as a cultural emergency. It was treated as a routine feature of exposition construction. The buildings were temporary. The art that decorated the buildings was treated as part of the buildings. When the buildings were demolished, the art was demolished too. This treatment reflected, in some sense, a particular cultural attitude about the relationship between art and architecture. The architectural ornament was understood as part of the architecture, not as independent artistic work. The architecture was temporary. The ornament was therefore also temporary. A different cultural attitude, one that treated the architectural ornament as independent artistic work worthy of preservation, regardless of the temporary character of the architecture, would have produced different outcomes. The sculptural work could have been removed and preserved. The art could have survived, even when the buildings did not. The actual outcome was the destruction of both. I want to walk through what the photographs preserved. The photographic record of the Pan-American Exposition includes, by my estimation, several hundred high-quality images that, taken together, allow a reasonably detailed reconstruction of what the exposition looked like. The images include point views of the esplanade and the major architectural axes, close views of the principal buildings showing facade detail, night photographs of the illuminated buildings, particularly the electric tower, interior views of the major exhibition halls, detailed photographs of specific ornamental elements, including the sculptural programs, photographs of the construction process, from foundations through completion, photographs of visitors, demonstrating scale and providing human context. These photographs constitute, in effect, a substantial visual archive. The archive is not complete. There are buildings that are documented from only one or two angles. There are interior spaces that have no surviving photographs. There are ornamental details that exist in the visual record, only at distances too great to make out clearly. But the archive is substantial. A patient researcher, working through the Library of Congress holdings, can reconstruct most of what the exposition looked like. What the archive cannot reconstruct is what the exposition felt like to walk through. The spatial experience, the sequence of architectural moments, the relationship between buildings and grounds, the play of light at different times of day, the sound of the fountains and the crowds. These are not preserved in still photography. The cinema, in 1901, was barely emerging as a medium. The exposition was documented in film, but the surviving film is extremely limited. The moving image record is essentially nothing compared to the still photographic record. What was lost when the buildings were demolished, in addition to the buildings themselves, was the possibility of any future generation experiencing the spatial reality of the exposition. The photographs preserve a partial impression. The spatial reality has gone beyond recovery. I want to spend a moment with the economic dimension of the expositions. The expositions were not just cultural events. They were major economic projects for their host cities. The construction phase generated employment. The exposition period generated tourist revenue. The subsequent development of the cleared sites typically for park use, residential development, or commercial purposes, generated long-term economic value for the host municipalities. Buffalo in 1901 was a major industrial city. It was the 8th largest city in the United States. It was a transportation hub for the Great Lakes shipping and for the major rail lines connecting the East Coast to the Midwest. It was the location of major manufacturing operations, particularly in steel and machinery. The Pan-American Exposition was, for Buffalo, an opportunity to demonstrate its civic standing on a national stage. The economic effects of the exposition were substantial. During construction, the project employed thousands of workers, providing local economic stimulus. During the exposition period, Buffalo hosted more than 8 million visitors over 6 months, a tourism volume that the city would not see again for decades. The hotels, restaurants, transportation services, and other tourism-related businesses experienced unprecedented activity. The post-exposition phase was less economically positive. The demolition employed workers, but at a smaller scale than construction. The visitor influx ended. The cleared land was returned to forest park use, which provided cultural and recreational value, but did not generate the kind of revenue that the exposition itself had generated. For the city, the exposition was an economic peak, followed by a return to baseline. The lasting economic legacy was modest. The improved park infrastructure seemed to some commercial development on the periphery, the cultural memory of having hosted a major national event. The economic calculation on this reading was that the exposition's 6 months of intense activity generated enough revenue and prestige to justify the cost of construction and demolition. The calculation was, in retrospect, mixed. The Pan-American Exposition Company itself lost money on the exposition. The bonds it had issued were not fully repaid. The public benefits accrued to Buffalo as a whole, but the private investors took losses. This pattern, public benefits, private losses, was characteristic of the major American expositions. The 1893 Chicago Exposition broke even financially. The 1904 St. Louis Exposition produced a small profit. The 1915 San Francisco Exposition lost money. The exposition format was not, in general, a reliable profit generator. It was a public-spirited investment that generated mixed financial returns. I want to address one more dimension of this story. I've been describing the exposition buildings as if they were simply temporary architecture demolished after their use. There is another dimension that I want to acknowledge, even though I cannot fully evaluate it. In some of the alternative history literature on this period, the demolition of the exposition buildings is treated as systematic suppression of evidence about a predecessor civilization that the buildings on this reading actually represented. The buildings on this hypothesis were not constructed for the expositions, but were pre-existing structures of a vanished civilization, sometimes called Tartaria, or some variant, that the exposition organizers used and then destroyed. I have earlier in the script indicated that this hypothesis is not supported by the documentary evidence. The construction records are extensive. The architects are documented. The construction processes are described. The buildings were, in the surviving documentation, designed and built for the expositions. The hypothesis is wrong in its core claim. The hypothesis is, however, asking a question that the standard historiography has not answered. The question is, why this pattern of build and demolish, sustained across multiple major expositions at enormous cost, producing some of the most ambitious architecture of the era? The standard answers: the buildings were temporary by design, the cost was justified by the cultural function, are technically defensible, but, in my view, do not fully account for the scale of investment and the scale of destruction. A better answer to the question might involve a fuller examination of what the exposition movement was actually doing, culturally and economically, in late 19th and early 20th century America. The expositions were not just civic celebrations, they were industrial showcases, they were tourism generators, they were urban development drivers, they were ideological projects, they were many things at once. A full account of the expositions would address all of these dimensions and would, I think, produce a more textured understanding of why the pattern was sustained. The full account has not, to my knowledge, been written. I want to walk through the question of what happened to the surviving buildings. A small handful of buildings from the major American expositions were preserved. The preservation, in each case, was the result of specific advocacy by particular individuals or institutions. The Palace of Fine Arts at the 1893 Chicago Exposition was preserved through the advocacy of Marshall Field and other Chicago business leaders. The building, which had been designed by Charles B. Atwood with the explicit intention that it might be preserved, was renovated in the 1920s and became the home of the Museum of Science and Industry. It is today one of the most visited museums in Chicago. The St. Louis Art Museum, which had been the Palace of Fine Arts at the 1904 Exposition, was preserved through the explicit decision of the Exposition Company in coordination with the city of St. Louis. The building, designed by Cass Gilbert, had been constructed with permanent materials specifically because preservation was anticipated. The Missouri History Museum, which had served as the entry building of the 1904 Exposition, was preserved through the advocacy of the Missouri Historical Society. The Palace of Fine Arts at the 1915 San Francisco Exposition was preserved through the advocacy of Bernard Maybeck, the architect, and a coalition of San Francisco cultural figures. The building had been designed by Maybeck with explicit attention to durability. When the time for demolition came, Maybeck led a campaign for preservation. The campaign succeeded. The building was retained and renovated, and it stands today as the Palace of Fine Arts Cultural Complex. These preservations are notable because they were exceptions. The default outcome at each exposition was demolition. The preservations required active advocacy against the default expectation. What is interesting in each case is how slim the margin of preservation was. The Chicago Palace of Fine Arts was nearly demolished. The renovation that saved it was undertaken only after years of debate. The San Francisco Palace of Fine Arts was nearly demolished. Maybeck's campaign succeeded, but only narrowly. The St. Louis Art Museum was deliberately designed for preservation, but the larger exposition was demolished comprehensively around it. The preservations were the exceptions. The destruction was the rule. I want to give you a breath here. We have walked through the architecture, the demolition, the cost, the lost sculpture, the photographic record, the alternative reading. You do not need to hold every name. You do not need to track every building. The Library of Congress is open to researchers. The local history museums in Chicago, Buffalo, St. Louis, and San Francisco hold extensive collections from their respective expositions. The architectural papers where they were preserved are at various university and institutional archives. I want to return to the architect I introduced earlier. I told you his name was Henry Cooper. I told you he was a composite figure, assembled from the documentary record of multiple real architects. I want to use him now to focus the story. Cooper in the narrative drew the buildings. He oversaw their construction. He attended the opening. He watched the visitors fill the spaces he had designed. Then he was retained to oversee the demolition. He drew, in the period of the demolition, a series of architectural records of the buildings he was about to take down. The drawings were detailed. They documented the structures in measured detail in a way that the construction drawings had not. Because the construction drawings had been about how to build the buildings, while the demolition drawings were about what was being torn down. The demolition drawings were, in effect, the last detailed architectural record of the buildings. They documented what the photographs could not show: the structural systems, the engineering details, the precise dimensions of the ornamental work. The drawings in the narrative I am constructing were preserved. They went into the architectural records of the firm. They were, in the years after Cooper's death, donated to the local historical society. They sit today in archival storage, available to researchers who choose to consult them. This narrative of an architect who drew the buildings, watched them be built, watched them be used, then drew them again as they were being demolished, is a composite. It is constructed from the actual experiences of real architects of the period. What I want to convey through this composite is the specific kind of professional grief that the exposition system produced. Architects gave their best work to projects whose temporary nature was built into the planning. They knew the buildings would be demolished. They drew elaborate facades anyway. They oversaw construction with care. They documented the demolitions, sometimes with measured drawings, as a final professional act of preservation. The architectural profession in this period was complicit in the production of temporary cities. The architects accepted the commissions. They accepted that the buildings would be demolished. They contributed their professional skills to projects whose products would not last. I want to walk through one specific document. Before I do, I want to take a moment with the visual experience of working through the photographic archives. When I was working at the Library of Congress, I would request boxes of stereograph cards from the various expositions. The boxes contained the original double-image cards that, when viewed through a stereograph viewer, produced three-dimensional images of the exposition scenes. The library has, in its reading room equipment, several functioning stereograph viewers. With permission from the staff, I was able to view some of the cards through the viewers. The experience was, in its way, unusual. Through the viewer, the photographs took on a depth that flat reproduction cannot convey. The buildings appeared three-dimensional. The walkways receded into the distance. The fountains had visible spatial extent. The visitors stood in space, not on a flat plane. For brief moments, with the viewer pressed to my eyes, I felt as though I were looking at the actual exposition. The illusion was strong enough that the disappearance of the actual exposition felt, for a moment, less complete. The buildings were, for an instant, present. Then I lowered the viewer, and the photograph was a flat card on a wooden table. The exposition was, again, gone. This is, in some sense, what the photographic archive does. It preserves enough of the visual experience that, in moments of attentive looking, we can imagine the lost environments. The imagining is partial. The actual environments are not recoverable. But the partial imagining is, itself, a kind of preservation. I want to walk through one specific document. In the archives of the Buffalo History Museum, there is a folder containing the working drawings for the electric tower at the Pan-American Exposition. The drawings are by John Galen Howard, who served as one of the design architects for the tower. The drawings are dated 1899 and 1900. The drawings are detailed. They show the tower in elevation, in section, in plan. They show the structural framework. They show the star facade details. They show the electrical lighting layout. The placement of each of the 40,000 incandescent bulbs that would illuminate the tower at night. The drawings are works of architectural draftsmanship of considerable quality. They were produced by a professional architect in the conduct of his work. They documented a building that, in 1899 and 1900, was being built. The tower was completed in 1901. It operated during the exposition. It was demolished in 1903. The drawings outlived the tower by more than a century. Today, in the climate-controlled storage of the Buffalo History Museum, the drawings still exist. They show what the tower was. They show how it was constructed. They show, in a more detailed and technically precise way than the photographs do, what the structure actually consisted of. The drawings cannot bring the tower back. They cannot reconstruct the night illumination. They cannot put the tower back on the Buffalo skyline. The tower is gone. The drawings are records of what is gone. But the drawings exist. They wait in their folders for researchers who want to understand what the tower was. I want to give you one more breath. The story I've been walking through is about a particular American cultural practice. The practice was build elaborate temporary cities to celebrate national ambition, then demolish them. The practice was repeated, at enormous expense, between approximately 1876 and 1939. The practice produced some of the most ambitious architecture of its era, almost all of which was destroyed. The practice is, by modern standards, peculiar. The expense was enormous. The destruction was substantial. The cultural justifications, on close examination, do not fully account for the scale of investment and the scale of loss. The practice has not, in the standard historiography, been adequately theorized as a cultural phenomenon. It has been described. It has been documented. It has not, in my view, been understood as the strange institutional production that it was. I want to walk through what the title of tonight's story claims. The title is The Last Architect Who Drew the Tartarian Towers Before They Were Demolished in 1903. The title is, deliberately, somewhat misleading. There was no Tartarian civilization that built the exposition buildings. The buildings were constructed by identifiable American architects for identifiable American expositions in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Tartaria hypothesis, in its core claim, is wrong. There was a last architect who drew detailed records of the buildings before their demolition, in the sense that the architects who worked on the demolitions did produce detailed measured drawings as part of the demolition process. The composite figure I described, Henry Cooper, represents this real practice. The buildings were, in fact, demolished in 1903 In the case of the Pan-American Exposition, the Electric Tower, the Temple of Music, the major Beaux-Arts pavilions, all gone by the end of 1903. So the title, while misleading in its invocation of Tartarian, captures a real historical pattern. Elaborate buildings, constructed at enormous expense, designed by major American architects, were systematically demolished. The architects of these buildings did, in some cases, produce detailed records of what was being demolished. The pattern is real even though the framing in terms of Tartaria is wrong. What the title gestures at, even in its inaccurate framing, is the substantial cultural loss represented by the demolitions. The buildings were not just temporary scaffolding. They were elaborate architectural achievements. Their demolition removed, from the American-built environment, a substantial body of work by major American architects. The Tartaria framing is wrong. The sense of loss the framing tries to capture is, in its essence, real. I want to spend a moment with the question of how the exposition movement ended, the pattern of major American expositions, which had begun with the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial and had continued through the 1939 New York World's Fair, did not continue past mid-century. There have been subsequent international expositions in the United States, Seattle in 1962, New York in 1964, Spokane in 1974, Knoxville in 1982, New Orleans in 1984, but none have approached the scale or architectural ambition of the great expositions of 1893 to 1939. The reasons for the decline of the exposition format are several. The economic case became less compelling as alternative tourist destinations developed. The cultural function of showcasing industrial and national progress was, by the mid-20th century, increasingly served by other media: newspapers, magazines, radio, eventually television. The architectural ambition that had characterized the earlier expositions became less culturally appropriate as modernism replaced Beaux-Arts neoclassicism. By 1960, the exposition format as it had existed in 1900 was effectively obsolete. Subsequent expositions used different architectural approaches, modest scale and shorter durations. They did not produce, on demolition, the kind of cultural loss that the earlier expositions had produced because they did not produce, in construction, the same architectural ambition. The decline is, in some sense, a fitting closure to the story. The peculiar cultural practice of building elaborate temporary cities and then demolishing them did not continue indefinitely. It ran its course over approximately 70 years and ended. What remains is the historical record, the photographs, the drawings, the surviving buildings where they were preserved, the institutional records of the various exposition companies. I want to spend a moment on the question of how to think about this kind of cultural practice. The exposition movement was, as I have noted, a peculiar cultural practice. Building elaborate temporary cities at enormous expense, knowing they will be demolished, is not a common cultural pattern in human history. It requires a particular combination of cultural confidence, economic resources, and acceptance of impermanence. The cultural confidence was the belief that the exposition format mattered enough to justify the cost. American cities of the late 19th and early 20th centuries were, in their own self-image, ambitious and powerful. They could afford to spend on temporary architecture. They believed the spending served important cultural purposes, demonstrating national achievement, attracting visitors, marking civic standing. The economic resources were the actual money available to undertake the projects. American industrial growth in the period had produced the kind of financial capacity that could fund elaborate temporary construction. The cities had access to bond markets, philanthropic capital, and federal support that allowed projects of this scale. The acceptance of impermanence was perhaps the most distinctive cultural feature. The participants understood that the architecture was temporary. They built it anyway. They built it well, they accepted the demolition as part of the project. This combination, confidence, resources, acceptance of impermanence, is not universally available to human societies. Many societies lack the resources. Many societies that have the resources lack the cultural confidence. Some societies that have both reject the acceptance of impermanence and insist on building only for the long term. The American Exposition movement represents a particular cultural moment when all three were present. The moment lasted about 70 years. It is, today, gone. I have been sitting with this story for about 3 months. I came to it from a different project, on urban development photography. I stayed with it because the more I looked at the photographs, the more clearly I saw that something extraordinary had happened in the period between approximately 1893 and 1917. American cities, on the sites of these expositions, had been built and unbuilt in a pattern that I could not, from outside, fully explain. The pattern is documented. The architecture is photographed. The demolitions are recorded. The architects are named. The pieces of the story are there. What is missing in the standard historiography is an integrated theorization of what the exposition movement was actually doing. The movement is described as a series of individual events. The events are described. The integration, the question of why this pattern was sustained over a quarter century at enormous expense, is not fully addressed. I want to walk through one more dimension of the story. It is the question of why the Tartaria hypothesis has emerged in the contemporary online research communities. The hypothesis is, as I have noted, wrong in its core claim. The exposition buildings were not pre-existing structures of a vanished civilization. They were constructed by identifiable American architects for identifiable American expositions. But the hypothesis has emerged. It has attracted substantial interest in certain online communities. It has been articulated, with varying degrees of sophistication, by a number of researchers and content creators. It persists despite the documentary evidence against its core claim. I want to consider why. One answer is that the documentary evidence is, in some sense, distant from contemporary popular awareness. The construction records of the major expositions are in archives. They are accessible to researchers, but not to the general public. The general public sees primarily the surviving photographs. The photographs show elaborate buildings. The buildings in the photographs look more elaborate than what contemporary popular culture associates with late 19th century American construction. The mismatch between the photographic appearance of the buildings and the contemporary popular expectation about what was being built in 1900 produces in some observers a suspicion that the buildings were not what they are described as being. The suspicion in some interpretive frameworks becomes the Tartaria hypothesis. Another answer is that the demolition pattern is, on its face, peculiar. The standard explanations, temporary by design, cost justified by cultural function, are technically defensible but, as I have noted, do not fully account for the scale of investment and destruction. The unexplained dimension of the pattern creates space for alternative explanations to emerge. A third answer is that the Tartaria hypothesis fits a broader contemporary cultural moment that is, in various ways, skeptical of established institutional narratives. The skepticism may have specific objects: historical institutions, contemporary governments, mainstream media. But it operates as a generalized predisposition to suspect that the standard accounts are incomplete or misleading. The Tartaria hypothesis fits this predisposition. It proposes that the standard architectural history has hidden something important. I want to be careful about how I am framing this. I am not endorsing the Tartaria hypothesis. I have said, and I continue to say, that the hypothesis is wrong in its core claim. But the hypothesis has emerged from real features of the historical record: the elaborate architecture, the systematic demolition, the gaps in the standard explanations. The emergence is not random. It is responsive to actual features of the case that the standard historiography has not fully addressed. A better developed standard historiography, one that more fully theorized the exposition movement as a cultural phenomenon, and that more fully explored the question of why this pattern of build and demolish was sustained, would, I think, leave less interpretive space for the alternative hypothesis to occupy. The interpretive space is created, in part, by the inadequacy of the standard explanations. Closing the space requires improving the standard explanations. I want to walk through the photographs one more time before I close. The Library of Congress holds, in its Prints and Photographs division, the substantial archive I have been describing. The photographs are accessible to researchers. They are also, in many cases, accessible online through the library's digital collections. A patient researcher, working through the holdings, can see what the Pan-American Exposition looked like in 1901, can see the electric tower against the buffalo sky, can see the esplanade with its fountains and statuary, can see the major pavilions with their elaborate facades, can see the visitors, in turn-of-the-century clothing, walking through what was, for 6 months, one of the most ambitious architectural environments in the world. The photographs cannot return the exposition, but they can show what it was. What it was substantial. What it was is gone. I want to spend a moment with how this story relates to broader American architectural history. The Beaux-Arts neoclassicism that dominated the exposition architecture was, by the 1930s, considered out of fashion. The rise of modernism, the increasing influence of European modernist architects, the cultural shifts of the interwar period. All of these moved American architectural taste away from the elaborate ornamentation that had characterized the great expositions. By the 1950s, Beaux-Arts buildings were, in many American cities, being demolished in favor of modernist construction. Major Beaux-Arts hotels, train stations, civic buildings, and theaters were torn down. The destruction of Pennsylvania Station in New York City in 1963 is the most famous example. But it was part of a much broader pattern. The architectural taste that had demolished the exposition buildings continued in subsequent decades to demolish the permanent Beaux-Arts buildings as well. The pattern of build and demolish, which had operated within the exposition format, extended, in a sense, into the broader architectural environment. By the 1980s, when the historic preservation movement had developed, much of the surviving Beaux-Arts architecture was being protected. Pennsylvania Station was gone, but Grand Central Terminal was preserved. Penn Station's destruction was the catalyst, in fact, for the development of stronger preservation laws. What remains today of late 19th and early 20th century American Beaux-Arts architecture is a partial sample. Some major civic buildings have survived. Many were demolished in the mid-20th century. The exposition buildings were demolished even earlier. The total picture of what Beaux-Arts American architecture looked like, in its full expression, is not preserved in physical form. The photographs preserve substantial documentation. The surviving buildings preserve fragments. The total achievement is, today, partly imaginative, reconstructed from the surviving evidence rather than experienced directly. I want to take you to one more specific document. In the Library of Congress, in the Prints and Photographs division, there is a photograph filed under the reference number LC-USZ 62-115847. The photograph is a night image of the electric tower at the Pan-American Exposition. The photograph was taken in August 1901 by an unnamed photographer working for one of the commercial stereograph publishers of the period. The image shows the tower illuminated by its 40,000 incandescent bulbs. The illumination extends across the lower portion of the photograph, picking out the detail of the tower's facade, the surrounding lower buildings, the reflecting pool at the base. The upper portion of the photograph is dark, the buffalo night sky against which the illuminated tower stands. The tower in the photograph is alive. It is illuminated. It is the focal point of an architectural environment that was, on the night the photograph was taken, the most spectacular built space in the United States. By the time the photograph was published in the stereograph series that distributed it, the exposition was already coming to an end. By the time the photograph entered the Library of Congress collections, the tower was already gone. The photograph survived. It is today available to any researcher who consults the library's catalogue. The tower is not. I want to walk you through one more specific architectural detail. The Pan-American Exposition included, among its many architectural elements, a series of pavilions representing the Latin American nations that the exposition was, ostensibly, celebrating. The pavilions were designed in styles drawn from the architectural traditions of the represented nations: Spanish colonial elements for Mexico and the Central American nations, neoclassical elements for the larger South American nations, and various combinations for others. The pavilions varied in scale. Some were modest structures, perhaps 50 feet across, providing exhibition space and meeting rooms. Others were substantial buildings, comparable in size to the major American palaces. The Mexican pavilion at the Pan-American Exposition was, in its design, one of the more elaborate of the Latin American pavilions. It was designed by Antonio Rivas Mercado, the principal architect of the Mexican pavilion delegation. It drew on Spanish colonial precedents, with elaborate ornamental sculpture and architectural detail. The pavilion was, in 1901, considered a notable architectural contribution. It was photographed extensively. Mexican delegations and visitors used it as their hospitality and exhibition center during the exposition. In 1903, when the exposition was demolished, the Mexican Pavilion was demolished, along with the other temporary buildings. I want to sit with this for a moment. The Mexican government had contributed the pavilion as a national exhibit. Mexican architects had designed it. Mexican artisans had created some of the decorative work. The pavilion represented, in physical form, the Mexican presence at the International Exposition. It was demolished by American demolition crews as part of the systematic clearing of the exposition site. The Mexican government did not, in the surviving correspondence I've been able to identify, raise objections. The Mexican pavilion was demolished on the same schedule as the American buildings. This is, in some sense, a small example of how the demolition culture of the exposition movement operated. Everything was demolished. The national contributions of foreign governments, the work of foreign architects, the decorative work of foreign artisans. All of it came down with the rest. The systematic character of the demolitions is what I find striking. There was no general practice of negotiating preservation arrangements with foreign governments for their contributed pavilions. The default was demolition. The negotiations, where they occurred, were for the few preservation exceptions. I want to walk through what this means in cultural terms. The exposition movement, in its peak years, was a major venue for international cultural exchange. Foreign governments contributed substantial pavilions. Foreign architects worked at considerable scale. Foreign artisans produced significant decorative work. The expositions were, in their day, important moments in the international cultural calendar. The systematic demolition of the foreign contributions meant that the cultural exchange was, in some sense, temporary by design. The foreign nations contributed work that they knew would be destroyed. The exchanges had a use-by date built into them. This is a particular kind of cultural arrangement. The exchanges occurred. The artifacts were produced. The artifacts were destroyed. What remained after the destruction was the memory of the exchanges and the photographic documentation. The physical contributions were gone. I have not, in the course of this research, found extensive documentation about how the foreign delegations experienced the demolitions of their contributed pavilions. The correspondence where it survives is generally formal and professional. The delegations accepted the demolitions as part of the exposition format. They contributed pavilions to subsequent expositions, knowing the pattern would repeat. The acceptance is, in itself, worth noting. The international participants accepted that their contributions would be temporary. They contributed substantial work anyway. The pattern was, in some sense, accepted as the price of participation in the exposition format. In 1901, in Buffalo, New York, a building called the Electric Tower stood 391 feet high. It was illuminated at night by 40,000 incandescent bulbs. It was photographed by hundreds of photographers. In 1903, it was demolished. The pattern repeated across the major American expositions of the period. Chicago in 1893 to 1894. Buffalo in 1901 to 1903, St. Louis in 1904 to 1906, San Francisco in 1915 to 1917. I want to spend a moment with the question of the workforce that built and demolished these expositions. Each major exposition required a substantial construction labour force. The 1904 St. Louis Exposition, at its peak construction phase in 1903, employed approximately 20,000 workers. The 1893 Chicago Exposition had employed similar numbers. The Pan-American Exposition, smaller in scale, employed perhaps 8 to 10,000 at peak. The workers were a mix of skilled craftsmen, masons, carpenters, sculptors, plasterers, and unskilled labourers who handled the bulk material work. The wages were, by the standards of the period, reasonable. Construction work on the expositions was, in many cities, considered desirable employment. The labour was organised through standard construction industry channels. Major contractors held the prime contracts. The prime contractors subcontracted specific elements to specialised firms. The specialised firms employed the skilled craftsmen and unskilled labourers directly. The workers, in their daily experience, would have been aware that they were building something extraordinary. The scale of the projects was enormous. The architectural elaboration was unusual. The compressed timelines created an atmosphere of urgency and significance. They would also have been aware, in most cases, that the buildings would be demolished within a few years. The temporary character of the construction was generally known. The use of staff materials was visible, to the workers handling them. The understanding that the work was for a specific short-term purpose was, by the standards of the construction trades, common knowledge. What this meant for the workers is something I have only partially been able to reconstruct from the surviving records. The construction trades of the period did not generally produce extensive written testimony from the rank-and-file workers. The labour history of the major American expositions exists where it exists, in fragmentary form. Union records, occasional individual memoirs, labour press reporting from the period. What the fragmentary records suggest is that the workers had a complex relationship with the temporary character of the construction. They took pride in the quality of the work. They executed the elaborate details with care. They built the buildings as well as they could. They also accepted, generally without articulated objection, that the buildings would be demolished. The temporary character was, in the construction trades culture of the period, simply part of how exposition work operated. The workers who specialised in exposition construction moved from project to project, from Chicago to Buffalo to St. Louis to San Francisco. The buildings they built came down. The next exposition needed new construction. The cycle continued. I find this acceptance on the part of the construction workforce worth noting. The workers were making the buildings as good as they could be made, knowing the buildings would be demolished. The skill and care of the construction is visible in the surviving photographs. The acceptance of the eventual demolition was, in the workforce's lived experience, part of the work. In each case, elaborate temporary cities were constructed at enormous cost, used for 6 months to a year, and then systematically demolished. The architecture of these cities was, by the standards of the era, among the most ambitious public architecture being produced. The architects were major American architects. The cost of construction was, in aggregate, on the order of building a major American city. The destruction was, in aggregate, on the order of levelling that city. The standard explanations, that the buildings were temporary by design, that the cost was justified by cultural function, that the demolitions were planned from the beginning, are technically defensible. They do not, in my view, fully account for the scale of investment and the scale of loss. The alternative reading, the Tartaria hypothesis, is wrong in its core claim that the buildings were pre-existing structures of a vanished civilization. The buildings were constructed by identifiable architects for identifiable expositions, documented in extensive construction records. The alternative reading is also, in its underlying intuition, that the standard explanations are incomplete, pointing at something real. The pattern of build and demolish, sustained across a quarter century at enormous expense, has not been adequately theorized in the standard historiography. What the buildings were for, the construction records describe in part. What the demolitions were for, the construction records describe less fully. What survives is the photographic record. The photographs are extensive. They are partial. They cannot bring the buildings back. They can show what was there. I want to walk through what this story means in the context of the broader erasure pattern I have been examining. In tonight's series of stories, the erasures have taken different forms. The Smithsonian giant skeletons were buried in the catalogue. The star forts were inherited as a form without explicit derivation. The Antarctic records were classified. The herbal medical schools were displaced by structural transformation. The exposition buildings were systematically demolished. The exposition's case is, in some sense, the most visible of the erasures. The buildings were not buried in archives. They were not classified. They were not institutionally dismantled. They were physically destroyed. Their destruction was contemporaneous with the events for which they were built. The visibility of the destruction is, in a way, what makes the story strange. The other erasures I have walked through tonight involved various kinds of institutional opacity. The exposition demolitions were performed in the open. The construction crews could see them. The neighbouring residents could see them. The newspapers reported them. The destruction was, in 1903 or 1906, an entirely public event. And yet the demolitions are, today, largely unknown. The Pan-American Exposition is remembered, in popular culture, as the place where President McKinley was shot. The buildings that the McKinley assassination occurred in are not in general remembered. The electric tower which dominated the Buffalo skyline for 6 months in 1901 is unknown to most Americans alive today. The destruction was visible. The forgetting was complete. This is, I think, a different kind of erasure. It is not the erasure of suppression or classification. It is the erasure of cultural attention. The events occurred, the events were documented, the events were not, by the inheriting generations, remembered. I want to spend a moment with the question of cultural memory. Cultural memory is, in some sense, what societies choose to retain. The retention is not automatic. It requires institutional infrastructure, museums, monuments, history textbooks, commemoration practices, scholarly attention. Without the infrastructure, even substantial cultural achievements can be forgotten within a few generations. The exposition movement had, in its peak years, substantial cultural attention. The events were front-page news, the buildings were featured in magazines, the architects were celebrated, the cultural significance of the events was, in their own moment, considered obvious. The cultural memory of the events has, in the subsequent century, largely faded. The buildings are gone. The architects are remembered, where they are remembered, for their other work. The expositions are mentioned in history textbooks as background context for the broader story of American industrial development. They are not, in general, treated as substantive cultural events in their own right. The fading of the cultural memory is, in part, a function of the demolitions. If the buildings had survived, they would have been physical markers that the events had occurred. Visitors to surviving exposition sites would have been reminded of what had been there. The buildings would have anchored the cultural memory. The demolitions removed the anchors. Without the physical markers, the events became increasingly abstract. The photographs survived, but photographs are inherently distant from the events they document. They support memory. They do not by themselves sustain it. What the demolitions produced, over time, was the gradual disappearance of the events from common cultural awareness. The events occurred. The events were photographed. The events faded. I want to walk through one final dimension of the story. It is the question of what the demolition felt like at the time. I have referenced the architects' experiences, the workers' experiences, the foreign delegations' experiences. I want to mention briefly the experience of the host city populations. The residents of Buffalo, in 1903, watched the Pan-American Exposition come down. They had seen it built. They had visited it. They had hosted millions of visitors during its operation. Then they watched it be dismantled over a period of months, until the site was returned to Parkland. The newspapers of the period covered the demolition. The Buffalo Evening News, the Buffalo Courier, and other local papers ran articles describing the progress of the work. The coverage was not, in general, lamenting. The demolition was treated as the natural conclusion of the project. The buildings had been temporary. They were coming down. The site was being returned to its intended post-exposition use. The Buffalo population accepted the demolition. There were no significant preservation movements. There were no public campaigns to save the buildings. There were no demonstrations. The demolition proceeded. The acceptance is, in itself, worth noting. The Buffalo residents had seen something remarkable. They had hosted what was, for 6 months, one of the most architecturally elaborate cities in the world. They watched it disappear. They did not, in the surviving record, articulate that the disappearance was a loss. This may reflect the cultural attitudes of the period. Late 19th and early 20th century Americans were, on balance, less attached to architectural preservation than later generations would become. The historic preservation movement was a development of the mid-20th century. In 1903, the assumption was that buildings came and went as part of the natural process of urban development. The exposition demolitions fit that broader cultural attitude. It may also reflect specific features of the exposition format. The buildings had been understood from the beginning as temporary. The expectation of demolition was, in some sense, part of the experience of the exposition itself. The visitors who walked through the elaborate facades knew that they were walking through something that would not last. The knowledge was, perhaps, part of what gave the exposition its peculiar emotional intensity. I want to acknowledge this final dimension because it complicates the framing I've been using. I've been describing the demolitions as something that was done to the architecture, to the artists, to the cities. The residents of the cities were not, in any obvious sense, victims of the demolitions. They were participants. They accepted the temporary character of the architecture as part of what made the exposition meaningful. A culture that builds elaborate temporary cities is one thing. A culture that demolishes elaborate temporary cities is the same thing, viewed from a different angle. The expositions were not built and then destroyed against the wishes of those involved. They were built and destroyed as part of a single cultural practice that the participants, by and large, accepted. The architect I described, Henry Cooper, is a composite. He represents the real architects who worked on these projects. They drew the buildings, they oversaw the construction, they attended the openings, they drew the demolitions, they moved on. Some of them, in their surviving papers, expressed regret. Some did not. They were professionals doing professional work, within the institutional framework that the exposition movement provided. The framework called for elaborate temporary architecture. They provided it. The framework called for demolition. The demolitions happened. The architects who drew the buildings before they were demolished did their best work by all available accounts on buildings they knew would not last. The work was good. The buildings were good. The demolitions were complete. The photographs remain. I want to give a final breath here. The story of the Great American Expositions is, in some sense, a story about a peculiar moment in American cultural history. The moment lasted approximately 70 years. It produced extraordinary architecture. It produced extraordinary destruction. It produced extraordinary photography. It is today largely forgotten by the general public, remembered primarily by architectural historians, urban historians, and the small communities of researchers who study American World's Fairs. The story is, in its broad outlines, knowable. The records exist. The photographs exist. The surviving buildings where they were preserved exist. A patient researcher can assemble the pieces. What the story shows at its core is a particular cultural willingness to produce magnificent architectural environments, knowing they would be destroyed. The willingness is, on its face, peculiar. It is not, in human history, a common cultural attitude. Most societies that have built elaborate architecture have intended for the architecture to last. The American Exposition movement was different. It built elaborate architecture, explicitly intended to be temporary. It built it anyway. It built it well. It demolished it on schedule. What this says about American culture in the period from 1876 to 1939 is, I think, worth thinking about. It says something about the relationship between architecture and time, between cultural ambition and cultural humility, between celebration and acceptance of loss. The expositions were celebrations. The demolitions were acknowledgements that the celebrations would not last. The photographs preserve what the celebrations looked like. The demolitions ensured that the celebrations would not themselves become permanent. The combination produced a peculiar cultural form whose like has not been repeated. In the Library of Congress, in the climate-controlled storage of the Prints and Photographs Division, the negatives and prints from the Great American Exposition sit in their archival boxes. They will, with reasonable care, last for centuries more. They will outlive their viewers. They will outlive the cities that hosted the events. They will outlive, almost certainly, the institutional arrangements that currently preserve them. What they preserve in their flat images is the moment. The moment is permanent in the photographs. It is gone in the world. The combination is what tonight's story has been about. I want to give one more thought before the close. The buildings did exist. The photographs proved that they existed. The construction records describe in detail how they were built. The visitor accounts describe what it was like to walk through them. The architect's papers describe how they were designed. The buildings were not figments. They were not Tartarian relics. They were real American buildings, designed by real American architects, constructed by real American workers, visited by real American visitors, photographed by real American photographers. And they were demolished. Real American demolition crews tore them down. Real American debris went to real American landfills. Real American sites were cleared and returned to other uses. The reality of the buildings and the reality of their destruction are equally documented. The standard historiography acknowledges both. What the standard historiography has not adequately addressed is what to make of the combination. The willingness, sustained across decades, to produce magnificent architecture, knowing it would be destroyed. The combination is what makes the story strange. The combination is what the alternative readings, in their inadequate ways, have tried to address. The combination is what a fuller historiography would, I hope, eventually theorise. The work has not yet been done. The photographs wait. I have been working on this story long enough to have developed strong feelings about the lost buildings. The electric tower in particular has, over the months of the research, taken on something like personal significance for me. I have not seen the tower. No one alive in 2026 has seen the tower. The photographs are the only record of what it looked like. What I have come to feel, working through the photographs, is a kind of retrospective preservation. The tower is gone. The photographs are not. The photographs preserve, in their flat, two-dimensional form, what was there. The preservation is partial. It does not bring the tower back. It does not allow visitors to walk through the spaces. It does not reproduce the night illumination. It does not provide the spatial experience. But it preserves something. It preserves the evidence that the tower existed. It preserves the visual record of what the tower looked like. It preserves the photographer's particular framings of the architecture. It preserves, indirectly, the cultural moment in which the photographs were taken. The photographs are not the tower. The photographs are what we have. They are, in their imperfect way, the form of preservation that the demolition culture of the period allowed. When the demolition crews finished their work at the Pan-American Exposition in late 1903, the site that had been the exposition was returned to parkland. Trees were planted, grass was sown. Within a few years, the site looked more or less as it had before the exposition had been built. A visitor to that part of Delaware Park in Buffalo today walks across grass that, in 1901, was the esplanade of one of the most ambitious architectural environments in the world. There is a marker indicating the site of the McKinley assassination. There are no other physical markers of the exposition. The grass grows, the trees mature, the park functions as a park. The tower, the palaces, the fountains, the sculptural ornament, the visitors in their turn-of-the-century clothing. All of this exists today only in the photographs and in the institutional records that document what was there. This is what the demolitions accomplished. They returned the sites to ordinary use. They cleared the elaborate temporary cities. They produced the parkland, the residential development, the commercial use that the cities had planned. They did not preserve the architecture. They did not, in most cases, preserve the sculpture. They did not preserve the experience. What they left behind was the photographic record. Thank you for staying with me through this story.